Hello everyone and welcome back to the Beer Junkies. Today we are going to be designing and brewing an Irish Stout. In this first part we are going to be going over the full recipe design, starting with the BJCP guidelines and then going into developing the BeerSmith recipe and then developing our water profile. In part 2 we will do step by step for our brew day to show you how we brew this beer. So stay tuned and follow us as we design this beer. Alright, first things first, we are going to go through the BJCP guidelines for the Irish Stout. Appearance-wise, this is what you're going to want it to look like. Its color is jet black and opaque, and it has a thick, creamy tan head that is long-lasting. Alright, overall, the Irish Stout is a black beer with a pronounced roasted flavor, often similar to coffee. The balance can range from fairly even to quite bitter, with the more balanced versions having a little malty sweetness and the bitter version being quite dry. The roasted flavor can range from dry and coffee-like to somewhat chocolatey. What stands out to me in this immediately is the roasted flavor lets me know that I'm going to want to use roasted barley. Up to 10% will add that roasted flavor without adding any harsh flavors. For the coffee and chocolate, I'm going to want to use a chocolate and or pale chocolate malts. That will add both of those flavors. And the malty sweetness, with this being paired that it is an Irish beer, I know that I'm going to want to use Maris Otter as the base. The Maris Otter is kilned slightly higher than a regular pale malt, so it will beef up the maltiness a little bit compared to some of those other base malts. Moving on to the aroma, everything follows the overall guidelines very well, but the only thing that stands out here that was not in the overall is that there can be a low earthy or floral hop aroma. And what that tells me is that if I want to, which I don't have to, I can add an English hop late in the boil to get that earthy or floral hop aroma. And two English hops that I really like to use are Fuggles and East Kent Goldings. I will use those most likely when we develop this recipe as both the bittering hops and the aroma hops if I decide to use them. But they are optional, so we do not have to if you don't want to. You can stop here and read this if you'd like to. I won't read the whole thing. The only thing that is additional here that we have not covered yet is the creaminess that is typical of these Irish Stouts. This tells me that I'm going to want to use flaked barley. Flaked barley adds a creamy mouthfeel and helps build up the body of these Irish Stouts. So I added this in because I wanted to mention the medium full body and creamy character again. That is going to come mostly from the flaked barley, but one thing you're going to have to remember with this style of beer, as you will with all of these dark beers, is that you are going to have a pH buffer with all of these roasted grains. Because we are going to add a significant amount of roasted barley, chocolate malt, and pale chocolate malt, you are going to need to add a pH buffer such as pickling lime or baking soda to raise that pH. If you do not, those malts that I just listed have a acidifying effect and will lower that mash pH into the 4s, which is not good for the beer health. It will reduce the body, it will inhibit yeast growth, it will cause off flavors. I mean, there's a whole list of things that you do not want that low pH to add. So we will cover this in the water profile development, but I wanted to mention it here so you get it in your head that you do not want that low pH. We will have to add a pH buffer. So this is everything that we just covered that we got from the BJCP guidelines. The malts, because it's a British beer, we're going to want to use Maris Otter as the base. This will help build up that maltiness on the back end. We're going to want that flaked barley to add that creaminess to the beer. We want the roasted barley for the color and that roasted flavor. The pale chocolate malt and the chocolate malt will add those coffee and chocolate flavors that you will want. For the hops, you'll use English hops. As I mentioned earlier, my two favorites are Fuggles and East Kent Goldings, but you can use any of the English hop varieties. They all add a nice earthy floral character to the beer. Finally, for the yeast, you are going to want to use an Irish ale yeast. These yeasts are modified to promote the maltiness in these beers, and it is definitely wanted for this style. Alright, we know what we want to add for this recipe, so now let's design it. First things first, let me name it so I know we are working on the Irish Stout. And then I will change the style to Irish Stout. So now I got my guidelines down here that I'm going to be shooting for, and I've got my name up here. Let me start adding my fermentables. So I know I'm going to want that Maris Otter. So let me find that. All right, Maris Otter. And I'm going to start with 6 pounds, see where that puts me. All right, now let me add my flaked barley. We will keep this right around 20% of the grain bill. This will add that creaminess that we really want. Continuing on, let me add the roasted barley. For the roasted barley, we are not going to want to add more than about 10% to the grain bill, because if we add too much of it, it will start to add a smoky, burnt flavor that is not characteristic of this style. Let me see where that puts me. 12 ounces. Let me get a little bit more. All right, just a smidge more. All right, so now I want to add some of the chocolate and coffee flavors. So I will add chocolate malt. And I will add just a dash of it. Probably about, let's see, what's that give me? Might be a little bit too high. So let me do, that's perfect. So I like to do chocolate malt and pale chocolate malt just to add a little bit of complexity to it. All right, let me see. The color, it's a little light. Let me add a little bit more of the roasted barley, get that a little bit closer to 10. All right, I think that looks good. So we've got a little bit high on the alcohol. That's okay. The color on the lower end, the original gravity is a little bit high, but this looks good for me. If you want to add a little bit less of the base malt, feel free to get that into the range, but this is totally up to you. Let's move on to the hops. So I'm going to want to use, I like the Fuggles, so I'll do 1 ounce at 60 minutes, see how much that gives me. All right, 16 IBU. So now I also want to add my other favorite, East Kent Goldings. And I'll do 1 ounce at 30 minutes. Get some of that earthy flavor and aroma. That puts me right at 30 bitterness. And I think that looks good. We've got the pale malt. That is going to give us that rich malty backbone. We've got the flaked barley to add the creaminess. We have plenty of roasted barley, just under 10%, so we won't get any burnt flavor, but we will get that roasted flavor that we want. I'm going to add 3.2 ounces of pale chocolate and chocolate. This will give us additional color, and it will also give us the chocolate and coffee flavors that we're looking for. The Fuggles at 60 minutes will give us that clean bitterness that we want, and then the East Kent Goldings at 30 minutes will give us a little bit of that earthy, floral flavor and aroma that we want on the back end. One thing to note, if you are not able to adjust your water profile or you are not sure, you can add these 3 malts, the roasted barley, the chocolate malt, and the pale chocolate, at the end of mash right before you begin to mash out. This will allow your mash to stabilize at about 5.3, 5.4 pH with just the pale malt and the flaked barley before you add in those roasted malts. It is not a perfect fix. It is definitely better to use a pH buffer such as pickling lime or baking soda, but if you are not able to do that, or you just want to try this out first, it works well enough that it will not be harsh or acidic. It will drop a little bit, but it will not drop into the 4s. So it is a suitable option if you do not want to worry about the buffer, but again, I would recommend doing that. Alright, now that we have our recipe all developed, I have inputted it here. We've got the Maris Otter, flaked barley, roasted barley, pale chocolate, and chocolate malts. We've got the quantities listed out, the colors inputted, and the percentage of grain bill calculated. So we can move on over here to the water adjustment tab and begin to adjust our water profile. So I've already inputted all of these, and this is the water profile that I came up with. We have 93 parts per million of calcium, 29 parts per million of sodium, 47 parts per million of sulfate, 44 parts per million of chloride, and as I mentioned, there's bicarbonate. This is my pH adjustment, and I'll show you what this pH changes to when I remove my pH adjusters. So This is a little bit higher than they recommend, but that's okay. It's still within the range that they recommend of 40 to 100, as long as it's in there somewhere. That is totally okay. So right now we have a mash pH of 2.8. My two pH adjustments are the baking soda and the pickling lime. If I take those to 0, I'll show you how intense these roasted malts are. Put that at 0 and that at 0. It drops me all the way down to 4.83. I definitely do not want that to be my mash pH. If I was mashing at 4.8, we are definitely going to taste that because it is going to make it very acidic. It's going to totally mess with the profile of the beer. The body's going to be thin, the head retention is going to be poor, and the yeast health isn't even going to be great. So again, make sure we add those two pH buffers in there. And if not, you can do what I mentioned in the previous video of adding the dark grains in at the very end of the mash. But regardless of what you do, make sure that pH stays where you want it to. That is the key to making a good Irish Stout. If you've ever had a horror story of an Irish Stout, it's probably because they did not make the adjustments they needed to their water profile. And as always, if you would like to see all of the things we just talked about in writing, feel free to visit our website, thebeerjunkies.com, go to the recipes tab and look up the Irish Stout recipe. It will talk about everything that we just discussed, starting with the BJCP guideline overviews. It will go through the malts, why we chose the malts we did and how we got to that point, the hops that we use and why we use them, the yeast that we recommend, the water profile, again with that baking soda and the pickling lime. And then this is a recipe that we just developed. We've got the grain bill that we just talked about. We have the hops we just used, and then the yeast. This part, the mash, boil, and fermentation, this is what I will be showing you in the next video when I walk you through how to brew this beer. All right, we have gone over the BJCP guidelines. We know exactly what we want it to taste like, smell like, and look like. We have developed our recipe in BeerSmith. We have developed our water profile. So we have everything we need in order to brew the Irish Stout. So stick with us for part 2 as we go through our brew day.